So in 1858, after Dred Scott, which of course Lincoln was horrified by the Dred Scott decision, he runs for Senate in Illinois against Stephen Douglas. And as you should know by now, or you should remember, Stephen Douglas, very powerful senator. He pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He's deep in the pocket of Chicago interest as well. And Stephen Douglas is a national figure. He's a national figure. People loved him, people hated him, but everybody knew who Stephen Douglas was. So what's interesting is of course, in our day, Abraham Lincoln's so much more famous than Stephen Douglas. Most people don't have any idea who Stephen Douglas is. But back in the 1850s, Douglas was the major figure. So Lincoln becomes famous through his senatorial campaign against Stephen Douglas, this very powerful senator. And so this is how Lincoln gains a national audience, his campaign against Stephen Douglas in 1858. So in some ways, he rides to fame on the back of Stephen Douglas. So they have a very, very famous series of debates during this election, the 1858 election. Douglas, if you read the Lincoln Douglas debate, I mean, you can't believe the racism. Douglas says stuff like, "Oh, Abraham Lincoln rode up to the let's say it was in Galena. He rode up to our debate today with his black mistress sitting right next to him in the carriage." Just like amazingly racist comments about Abraham Lincoln. So certainly Lincoln, by our lights, would be considered racist, but man, compared to Douglas, there's no comparison really. So Lincoln is put on the defensive. Lincoln, during the Lincoln Douglas debates, he has to tell the people of Illinois, the white males of Illinois, no, I don't believe in racial equality. No, I don't believe in intermarriage between whites and African Americans. No, I don't think that African American males should have the right to vote. But he says, notwithstanding this, and this is a direct quote, there's no reason why the Negro, and of course he used this word, it's a very old-fashioned word today, there is no reason why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I agree with Judge Douglas that the Negro is not my equal in many respects. Certainly not in color, perhaps not in moral or intellectual endowment. But in the right to eat the bread without permission of anybody else, which his own hand earns, he is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every living man. So this statement is what a lot of people historians and other folks point to when they talk about Lincoln being racist. This enumeration of why the African Americans shouldn't have these basic rights, that they don't have an equal intellect, etc. But what I would point to, I guess, and maybe I'm a Lincoln apologist, who knows, that his statement, I agree with Judge Douglas that the Negro is not my equal in many respects, but in the right to eat the bread with permission of anybody else, which his own hand earns, he is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every living man. So Lincoln recognizes the natural rights of African Americans, but do let me stress that the most damning aspect of Abraham Lincoln when it comes to race relations is his desire to persuade African Americans to leave the United States. And it's ridiculous. You know, there's 4 million African Americans in the U.S. almost by 1858. African Americans, as we talked about, as Frederick Douglass points out in And what to the slave of is the 4th of July? African Americans had built this country. The wealth of this country was built in large part by African Americans. So the idea that you're going to get 4 million people to leave the country that they'd help build and make prosperous is absurd. And of course, most African Americans, or at least a good majority, had been in the United States since before. Well, all of them had been in the U.S. since before 1808, but many had been in the U.S. since the 1700s. It's just ridiculous, this idea, this colonization idea. But Lincoln held on to it, and he hangs on to it deep into the Civil War. And we'll talk more about Lincoln's colonization schemes, which all failed miserably once he became president. So during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Lincoln comes up with his very famous very famous statement: "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe that this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do believe that it will cease to be divided. It will either become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it." And again, this is the nub. This is the nub, people. The idea of arresting the spread of slavery, "and place it where the public mind shall rest the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction," right? By containing slavery, you put it on the course of ultimate extinction. So Lincoln was an abolitionist, but he was a gradualist. He was not an immediatist. And many abolitionists hated him for that. They thought he was way too moderate, way too slow on the question of abolition. So ultimately, what happens in 1858, Lincoln becomes a national figure. He degrades and derides the Dred Scott decision. He talks about the slave power, although he talks about it in coded language, that the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Dred Scott had become a piece of machinery. And that's a direct quote: "piece of machinery in the hands of Southerners and their Northern Democratic allies." Lincoln said that that it was clear that there were evidences of design and concert of action, that among its chief bosses to give slavery an eternal future in the United States. That the goal of the slave power conspiracy was to open all the national territory to slavery. That in the debates, he says to Douglas that Douglas is part of the group that wants to expand slavery not only into the new territories, but into the states where it had been outlawed. And Douglas says this is not true. He believes in popular sovereignty. And Douglas says, look, you would never have slavery in Ohio because the people of Ohio wouldn't allow it. If you let democracy run its course, then it will die out of its own accord. Well, Lincoln didn't buy that. And he also gave a moral argument. He said, some things you can't put up for a vote. Slavery is an intrinsic evil. You can't put slavery up for vote because it's evil. You can't vote on an evil thing like slavery. It is just wrong. And you can't even put it up to a possibility of a vote because it is just so evil. So anyway, there's a full airing of the two positions during the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln loses. Douglas wins. He is reelected senator. But through these debates, Lincoln becomes a national figure by debating Douglas. And as we know, 2 years later, he'll be elected president.